Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little, and today we're going to be discussing when you should donk bet when playing no limit Texas Hold'em. To be very clear, a donk bet, which is not a nice term, let's call it a lead, is when you are the pre-flop caller from out of position, which means someone raised and then you called from the small blind or the big blind, or you raised, somebody re-raised, and then you called, they're re-raised from out of position, and then you bet into the aggressor from the previous betting round. So, most commonly this occurs when someone raises, you call from the big blind, the flop comes, and then you opt to bet into the pre-flop aggressor. This is not considered a continuation bet because you were not the initial pre-flop raiser. Continuation bets can only come from the pre-flop raisers, and donk bets or leads can only come from the pre-flop caller. You could also lead on the turn or river, but we're not going to be discussing those spots today. In 98% of situations, you should check to the preflop aggressor. You should not lead very often at all, but there are a few really excellent spots where you should donk bet, lead, and put your opponents in awful situations. But first, let's look at why donk betting is so uncommon. Donk betting is almost always not a good play. It's a bad play for three main reasons. First, if you only called on the previous betting round, your opponent is typically going to be the player who has the highest frequency of good strong hands in that spot on the next street. As a very clear example, say someone raises and you just call from the big blind. Well, you probably don't have pocket aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king in your range because you would have re-raised those before the flop, which means on the flop, you don't have aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king in your range, but your opponent does. And those are typically very strong hands in most scenarios. So because they have a lot of obviously strong hands in their range that you don't, you have to do a whole lot of checking. Next, you do not want to give the in-position player any additional information about the strength of your range. And typically, because you want to put money in the pot when you have a good hand and you want to check when you don't, well, when you bet, it implies you have a decently strong hand and then your opponent can play logically, right? But if you check with both your strong hands and your marginal hands and your junk and your draws, your opponent's not going to know what you have when you check. The more you can do to make your range difficult to read, the better. Now, some may say, well, I can just lead with all sorts of nonsense and trick my opponent. Maybe you can for a little while, but they're going to figure out really fast that you're leading with a nonsensical range. Finally, when you are out of position, I can't type. You need to play much more cautiously because it's difficult to control the size of the pot. When you are out of position, you typically don't want to allow the pot to get gigantic unless you are favored. And by betting from out of position, you give your opponent the chance to raise and make the pot gigantic, which is not what you want with the majority of your marginal hands. With your marginal hands, you simply want to check and see what develops and keep the pot manageable. Now, certainly with your absolute best hands, you want to put money in the pot sometimes. And with some draws, especially high equity draws from out of position, you don't mind putting in the money in the pot. But for the most part, from out of position, you're going to want to keep the pot as manageable as possible. So now that you know you should not donk bet very often at all, when should you donk bet? When is it actually a great play? Well, donk betting occurs in spots where the board changes so much in your favor that if you check, your opponent should not feel inclined to bet because it's good for you. This is often going to occur from the big blind. When someone raises, you call from the big blind and the flop comes all middle cards, like 7, 6, 5. When you're playing somewhat shallow stacked, that's a pretty reasonable situation to lead a lot because you have all the straights, two pairs, and sets in your range, whereas your opponent's going to be missing a lot of the two pairs and the straights because they're not going to raise with 8, 9 offsuit from under the gun, right? So that's a spot where your opponent should check behind a lot. And since you have a lot of hands in your range that don't want to let it check behind, like one pair hands or one pair with draws, you opt to lead instead. Typically in those spots when you lead, you lead for a small size just to push your general range advantage across the board. Recognize that if you always check in these spots instead, where you should develop some leads, you won't get enough value, and your range has a lot of decent hands in it that don't mind pushing a little bit of money in the pot. And you're not so concerned about controlling the size of the pot because you have a lot of really good hands in your range that don't mind making the pot big. Okay, let's take a look at a few examples and we'll run through the GTO solver to show very clearly that you should develop leads in these spots. Most of the time when you lead, It's going to be when you're playing shallow stacked. If you're playing 80 big blinds deep or more, which is often going to be the case early in a tournament or in cash games, you should never lead. If someone leads, they're almost always playing quite poorly, or they're doing it exploitatively because they think their opponents are going to respond really poorly. Here, we have the low jack, raising it up, 30 big blinds deep. We call with the 7-6 of spades. Flop comes queen, 6-5. This is not a spot where we need to develop leads at all. Why? Because even though the 6 and the 5 are there, the low jack don't have a whole lot of hands containing a queen in their range. Let's take a look at this. In peakgto.com, we have the low jack raising. We call in the big blind with this range. Okay, notice our 7-6 calls every time. Red is re-raise small, dark red is go all in, green is call, blue is fold. And then the flop comes queen, 7-6. Actually, queen 6-5. Let's get it right. Queen 6-5. We're going to check everything on the flop. And then the opponent continuation bets, sometimes big, sometimes small. This time we have them going roughly 4 big blinds. And 7-6 is going to call the vast majority of the time. Okay? We're going to call. Now go ahead and consider which turns are going to be really good for the preflop caller that will also then check call on the flop. Well, we are going to check call the vast majority of our 6s. And the opponent should not have very many 6s because they raised from the low jack seat. So if the turn is a 6, let's say it's the 6 of hearts, notice we're going to develop a whole lot of leads. And take a look at this. Lots of our 6s lead small. We also get to lead small with a whole lot of other stuff like draws. Notice all these 9-7, 9-8, etc. are leading a decent chunk of the time. Our top pairs are fine enough to lead. Bottom pair actually gets to lead for value/protection. And then just some junkers like king jack, king 10, right? These are hands that can get better hands to fold. Notice when you are leading, though, you're leading because you have a bit of a range advantage. The total equity here is pretty good. We're in good shape in this situation from out of position. So when it comes to 6, after we check call the flop, we lead small. Good, strong GTO poker. The opponent calls. River's a 10. Let's say we do lead small. Opponent calls. River is the 10. Now, because we are shallow stacked, we're going to be making a roughly pot size bet all in with a whole lot of hands containing a 6 and some sporadic bluffs. The best bluffs are often going to be the hands that completely lack showdown value, assuming blockers are not that relevant. And we see 4-3, 4-2, and 3-2. Jam it all in basically every time, as does 8-4, 7-4, and 7-3. So ask yourself, would you have played this hand this way? Would you have ripped it in? Now, when you do rip it in with a bluff, sometimes they're going to call. If they have a queen, of course they're going to call. If they have a 10, they might even find a hero call. And you're going to lose when you're bluffing. But recognize you're also going to get maximum value when you have a very strong made hand like a 6. Notice instead, what's often going to happen is if we do not lead the turn, it's just going to go check, check. And on the river, we bet, and they're going to call, and they're going to lose a medium-sized pot. But by leading, we get to put a ton of money in with all of these 6s, which actually is a decent chunk of our range. All right, next example. Here we have 7-5 suited. 40 big blinds deep now. Low jack raises. We call. Flop comes 7-6-4. Let's take a look at this in the GTO solver. Low jack raises. We call. It comes 7-6-4. And notice right off the bat, we're developing leads. This is the spot I discussed earlier, where we're going to have a whole lot of middle-low connected cards, and the opponent simply does not. So when we lead, we're leading small. We don't have an equity advantage, but we have a lot of hands that are pretty decent. So we are leading in this situation decently often. Notice our 7-5 is leading some, not always, but some. Notice a lot of 2 pairs are leading. 6-5 for pair plus draw leads a lot. 8-5 is the nuts. That's leading a decent amount of the time. Lots of hands containing a 5 or an 8 or a 3 get in there and lead small. This is a situation where a lot of players in a lot of games check every single time. And clearly that's a mistake because you should be leading small with about 38% of your range, a pretty good chunk of it. We go for the small bet. Opponent calls. Turns to 3 of spades. We have a straight. That's clearly great. So we lead. They call, turns 3 of spades. We are now going to bet very often, maybe almost every time. Solver's thinking. Definitely check out peakgto.com if you have not already. It can solve a whole lot of scenarios for you. Notice we actually lead small on the turn, or 2/3 pot on the turn, or pot on the turn every single time. 100% of the time. And that is because we have a gigantic equity advantage on this 5 because we have a lot of straights in our range and 2 pairs. And the opponent who raised from the low jack seat remember, here's their range on the turn. They're supposed to call the flop bet, the small flop bet, with like any 2 cards almost. Facing the small flop bet, they have to call very frequently because they're in position getting very good odds, right? They're supposed to call king jack offsuit, king 10 offsuit, et cetera, et cetera. And all those hands are total trash on the 3 turn. So we get to bet. We can go small or medium. Notice our 7-5 is mixing sizes between small, medium, and large. Let's see what we opt to do this time. I would probably go 2,000-ish. We go 1,500 this time, so we go for the smallish bet. Let's use the 2.3 bet. And we're going to get called. River is a queen of hearts. We have 2 times the size of the pot remaining. How much do we bet on the river? Some players think automatically, all in. But I think that's probably overkill in the spot because the opponent's range is very, very marginal. In this scenario, most of our bets on the river, on the queen, should be, I gotta presume, medium. And it does look like we are mixing between pot, 25% pot, sometimes tiny bets. 7-5 is going large a lot of the time for pot, which makes a lot of sense, right? Clearly a very strong hand. We could conceivably have some all-ins. Typically when you have super nuts in your range, you want to mix some all-ins. But in the spot, especially I think in the real world, because we're trying to get called by a marginal range, we're going to want to go for the small or the medium size. This time, though, they just give us the pot. All right, one more hand. Low jack raises. 40 big blinds deep. We call with the 3-2 suited. You should defend any 2 suited cards against the min raise 40 big blinds deep in the big blind. Flop comes 9-5-4. Now take a second, think about it while I pull this up in Solver. Do you think we should lead on this flop? While you're thinking about it, write in the comment section down below. Click the notification bell, click the like button. In this scenario, they raise pre-flop, we call, it comes 9-5-4. I'm going to guess we do not have very many leads at all in this situation. But, oh, wrong flop. Always get the flop right. 9-5-4. Notice we have no leads. Why is that? That's because even though the board does contain middle cards, it's not all that connected to the point that we have a whole lot of super nut hands in our range. So this is not a spot where we get to lead. We check. They go for the 2/3 pot. And with our 3-2 suited, we are going to call. You may say, why not raise? We have a straight and flush draw. We do have a straight flush draw, right? We do. Even though we have a straight flush draw, we don't really want to raise to, let's say, 9 big blinds, because if we raise and then get shoved on, we're now in a very roughly break-even spot. So take a look at what raises in this situation. We're mostly raising with good made hands, a 9 or better, and then some slightly better draws that have overcards and flush draws, right? Notice all of these flush draws are putting in raises. These are all only raising with their club. If we have, really, we won't have an overcard to the 9 is what it amounts to. A lot of our lower flush draws, like 8-6 of clubs, calls every time. Same thing with 8-7 of clubs, right? These are hands are simply checking and calling. This is a common thing you will discover if you study GTO strategies. 40 big blinds deep, you don't check raise a whole lot of pretty good draws that don't really want to get shoved on. You only check raise draws that are either very happy to fold to a shove or they're very happy to call the shove. And 3-2 of clubs is going to be somewhat neutral. Turns native diamonds. Do we get to lead here? You essentially want to ask, do I have a whole lot of 7-6 in my range that my opponent does not? And the answer here is very clearly yes. Let's say 8 of hearts turn. We lead a lot. And notice, when we lead, we're leading for a small size typically. That is the case here, 25% pot, and the 3-2 is leading a large chunk of the time. Okay? Other hands that are leading. Pairs, 8-7, pocket 7s, 8-6, right? Medium strength hands, as well as some 9s that are happy to get money in, and then some sporadic bluffs. I got to presume it's going to have a 7 or a 6. And notice here, lots of 7s and 6s are putting in some leads, as well as a 3-2. We lead, they call. River is a 7 of spades. What do we do with the 3-2 now? We have 1.5x pot on the river. I can already tell you we're going to bet, because we have a lot of straights in our range and they do not. Always consider who has the nuts and who does not. We are going to lead in the spot very often for a huge size, all in 1.5x pot with lots of 7s or lots of 6s, 2 pairs. Those are good enough because the opponent doesn't really have many hands better than 2 pairs as well. We do get to go for some smaller value bets with the 9, which is interesting. Lots of hands we decided to bluff with that just have nothing are going for the bluff, including our 3-2. All in, opponent folds, and we scoop a pot. So that is it. That is when you should donk bet. Hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a quick favor before you leave. Click the like button. Click the notification bell. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I hope all of your leads work out wonderfully. I'll talk to you next time.